So I've gone ahead and started the recording, and as I always say at the beginning of these, good morning, welcome to the Kubernetes community meeting. Today is March the 31st, and we are recording our session, so please remember that everything here will be made public at one point or another. And let's see, I had something from the chat. Yes, Doug, I am in a ski lodge. In fact, I'm at the Linux Foundation Collaboration Summit. So we are doing CNCFE board meeting things here, and we will be doing all sorts of conversations about open source and fun. So let's get this meeting kicked off. And Oliver, you're here from Linkerd to do our first demo today. Actually, our only demo today, but to get us kicked off. So, do you want to give us an update or an info about what Linkerd is, and then show us your demo?
Yeah. So Linkerd actually.
Linkerd. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. It looks like that word. Let me see if I can put together some. Let me share my screen. All right.
There we go. Oh, he's got a lovely view on his screen too.
Yeah, is this going to work? Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm here to talk about Linkerd. A little bit about myself first. We started Buoyant about a year ago. A bunch of ex-Twitter people to take a bunch of the operational lessons we had at Twitter and bring them to the growing world of microservices. And so naturally, we've been playing with Kubernetes a lot over the past year or so. And we've been applying a bunch of the open source tech that Twitter had onto that environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that open source and then get into the demo kind of quickly if we can. So the way I view this is that we have a lot of tools and technologies at the bottom of the stack to deal with provisioning, hardware abstractions, all these things kind of at the data center level. And hopefully up at layer 7, I'm not writing my code specifically to deal with that stuff. Yet there's this glue layer to operate at scale that I need to abstract a lot of these things and to be able to operate in different environments and to operate safely and reliably. And so that's where RPC comes in. We need to be able to map requests onto the data center, the business logic on the data center. And so now we're seeing tools kind of emerge at layer 5 specifically, which is where Finagle comes in. And so Finagle is an open source library that Twitter wrote. Is that a question? No. Okay. Open source library that Twitter wrote starting around 2010 to deal with a lot of common problems that Twitter was encountering at the time. Since then, a lot of other people have adopted it, primarily for the programming model. So there's about 5 lines to write a new service. And this here is a little proxy that I whipped up. And what this does is just proxy something. And what you don't see here is anything to deal with operational concerns. We don't see connection pooling, or we don't see service discovery, tracing, accounting. None of that stuff is in that code. And so this is used at Twitter to make services operable. And we're taking that and applying that into Linkerd, which we view as kind of a dynamic linker for microservices. So where you had a linker to link libraries together, now we have to do that at the data center level. And so this was released about a month or 2 ago. And it's built on Finagle, which we know and trust, and it's highly pluggable. We can do things like protocol upgrades. We can monitor kind of uniformly in a polyglot environment, deal with service discovery, back pressure timeouts, et cetera, et cetera. Just yesterday, we released a service called Namerd, which I'm going to demo as well. And this is this kind of service discovery abstraction that lets us top of existing service discovery systems and control them in a flexible way. In Kubernetes specifically, we're running Linkerd as a sidecar. So we'll have a little demo in a second. And then in each pod, I deploy a Linkerd, which deals with all the communications. So my service now just sends things to localhost. And the service I register into the Kubernetes master is actually Linkerd. And Linkerd can take over the rest of that, including things like TLS upgrading, multiplexing upgrading, and things like that. In this service, you'll see that we have 2 routers. We have an incoming router, which is that we listen for incoming connections and send everything to service. And on the outbound side, we look things up via the Kubernetes master, but we're going to do that through Namergy today. And so my demo is Job's microservice. It's based on Arrested Development, if you're familiar with that show. And what we're going to do is we've rewritten Job's program as a microservice. So we have a web front end and two backend services. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a new version of the Gen service and be able to manage traffic onto that and failover onto that. We're going to use Namergy to do it. All right, all right, so here we go. First, I am going to create Namergy. I have created a few services already, but I don't have any pods running. Also, I'm going to warn you, there are public IPs in this demo. It's a lot easier if you don't hit them. The demo may go poorly if you do, but like I said, it's all new, so we're still figuring out authentication and things like that. All right, so first, I'm going to create Namergy. And so we've created a config map. The config map is a little YAML file that tells us how to talk to the Kubernetes master. And then we expose a thrift service that our Linkerd users will communicate to, and a control service that we will send commands through. So if we look at the service, the control service actually gets an external load balance port so that we can send it things. And everything else is internal. And so there's this delegation language that maps us from maps requests onto service discovery. And so we'll look at our default tab. And so at the bottom, we're going to send all HTTP requests, and we're going to map that into the default namespace on the HTTP port. And so I can now create that. Oops. That doesn't work. Oh, sorry. There we go. I have to name it. Let's call the default one. Okay. So now I should be able to get this back from the server, and it will repeat what we just gave it. Oh, that's not the name of it. There we go. All right, next I'm going to create the config map for Linkerd. That will be mounted in all of the services we deploy. And so the config map there, as I said, we have an ingress side of this, which just takes HTTP requests and forwards them to the local service. And then on the outbound side, we look things up in Namergy. Okay, now I can actually deploy my service. Control. I'm going to launch the web service first. The Gen service. And a word picking service. And now I should be able to, can I actually get a Chrome here? There we go. And so here's the admin page for Linkerd, which I've exposed. You'll see I'm running one web service, so I can show you a good admin page, but I'm running many of the backends. And so we don't see any clients configured in here yet. We only see the servers we've created. Now I should be able to send out a request. And let's see, I'll do wireless working. Okay, we got a response back, and I should see one. Yeah, we've actually created a client on the fly there. And so now I'll send it something like, and we should create more clients. Yeah, there we go. And we see some traffic coming through the site now. Great. So now that we've done that, we've got a service up and running. Everything's been provisioned on the fly, and it's mapped into the Kubernetes namespaces here. And so now the CEOs come down and said, we've got to make this thing work. We got to make some money off of this. So we have a growth hack. Let's go look at my growth hack. What we see here is that we've fixed our code to tell everyone how much we love Kubernetes, and we put some pretty new lines in there. And so now I'm just going to deploy that. I've also created new service names and pod names so we can distinguish them from the old service. I will create those now via and within a second or two, they should be up and running. And now I can run that curl command again, and nothing's changed. We haven't actually routed this or connected this into the traffic at all. So the really cool thing we can do with Linkerd is I can now start to do overrides on a per host basis, on a per request basis rather. So I can say, I'm going to change this so that when I talk to the gen service, what I really want is the gen growth hack service. What's going to happen? I hope it works. Yes, bees love Kubernetes. So we've now, and that's on a per request basis, so I go back, we're back on the old site. And so this becomes a nice mechanism for doing things like canarying or staging. I can do this in a very ad hoc fashion. Okay, now that we've done that, I'm going to throw some load on the site. So I wrote a little bit of a request generator. It's going to just send a bunch of requests on the site. We'll see what happens. Just to see that this was put automatically. Okay, so now we have a bunch of requests going through here. Up and up, there we go. All right, so now I want to slowly add load onto my new service. So I'm gonna look at, I've changed my, my DTab. And we see that I'm going to do a 20-to-1 ratio between the old service and the new service. So I should do name control, update, default. And pretty quickly, we're going to see load shift over. Yeah, and we see a little green line at the bottom there. That's our new code there. All right, so we're pretty happy with it. It's going well. I'm going to go change the weights, and let's give it a bit more percent. So we'll do 20% to new service, and we'll update that again. We should, yep, it increases there. And so we'll see this bigger percentage. And okay, we're really happy with it. We're gonna go 50-50. So all evens out pretty quickly. Okay, so CEO is so impressed. We're now going to put that in production. We're going to say everything goes to the growth service as long as it's there. If that disappears for some reason, I still want to go back to the old service. And so we put this alternate in there. Boom, immediately we see all the traffic on the new service. But we had to pull the plug. The CFO is really unhappy with it. And we will delete service. Yeah, let's delete that service. And immediately we fall back, staying at 100% success rate across the board. So this gives us a flexible mechanism that's kind of system agnostic. It works well on top of Kubernetes, but also works well to bridge Kubernetes with other systems. And gives us a nice flexible traffic layer. This all sits on top of the service abstraction in Kubernetes, and so we're using services as the backend for this. Finally, just a little plug. We have these are both very new projects, and we're looking for help as wherever we can get it. We're really excited about the third-party API, so we're going to store those DTab states that we were showing you here in the third-party API. We're looking to set up kube proxy configurations or ingress controller configurations. And there's a bunch of active work with gRPC people to add HTTP2 support into Netty, which we're built on. So that's all coming pretty soon. Also, that UI, oh, I had a typo on this. Sorry about that. We have a new UI coming. It's a little bit nicer than this and shows latencies and things like that. It's a little sneak peek. And finally, if you want to get in touch with us, we have a beautiful website at linkerd.io. We have a Slack channel. We're happy to chat about this stuff. Or you can hit me on Twitter or email. I'm happy to get in touch, wherever's convenient for you.
Awesome.
So thanks very much.
Does anybody have any questions? We've got about a minute and a half where I'm happy to entertain questions, or of course you can find Oliver in all those places that he listed.
So I have a question, Oliver. When you talk about the Q proxy there, are you looking to integrate with the Q proxy, or perhaps, like operate in place of the Q proxy?
Yeah, I think we're looking for suggestions of the best way to integrate this. I'd like the per host model where we can run one of these in every host and have that kind of not be in a per pod environment necessarily. But we don't want to take on TCP responsibilities. We want to take on kind of just the layer 5 responsibilities. So yeah, I could see either or, depending on on the environment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Awesome. Well, there's ways to find Oliver on the internet, I hear. So please reach out to him. And of course, we'll find all sorts of ways to get Linkerd and Kubernetes to play nicely together.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So I didn't go through the agenda, and I'm going to once again make a pitch for a note taker, because Rob Hirschfeld has been wonderful in taking notes through the demo, but he has to jump out early. And we also don't want to rely on the same person every week, because that starts to be a really onerous job. So can I get somebody to pipe up, volunteer, and plan to take notes through what I hope will be a very interesting and important conversation up next? Very quiet, everyone. Okay, we do need a note taker. So the conversation that is going to be up next is the community development process conversation. So finding ways to improve what we have, change and adapt, and of course make this better, more inclusive, and most certainly more clear as to how to get the community to be enabled within making contributions. I threw a link into the document for what the Cloud Native Compute Foundation is beginning as a development vision. So what the Technical Oversight Committee has started to draft as their big view on how projects in the foundation will look at, consider, and move forward with their development processes. So there are things in there like velocity first and running code and other, clearly, I would say clearly non-controversial, but of course people may want to discuss this development process or this development vision, really the way I'd see it. And as I've mentioned a number of times with the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, we are the first incubated project, and we as a community get to help figure out what the Cloud Native community or Cloud Native Compute Foundation community looks like and how the projects work. So please do take a look at this draft and make comments if you think it's not as obvious and straightforward as I do. Now, this doesn't mean that my view is, of course, the only one on all of this, and we do want lots and lots of community contributions on it. So take a peek at that. And then there's the other link that is in here is a proposal that Joe Beta has put forward to try and help us as the community rationalize what the development process looks like, make sure it's clear, because as we move from a Kubernetes being a initially fairly narrowly governed project with just Google initially, and then Google and Red Hat, and then Google and Huawei and Google and other small other companies making contributions. We want to move this to a broader community engagement. So that means we have to codify what we have been doing and then tune it to fit this evolution. So Joe's pulled together a how do we track effort and not be necessarily as focused strictly on features, and then how do we make this process more transparent for everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and let Joe talk a little bit about his document. And of course, we want this as a draft. We want this to have feedback and commentary both here and in the document.
So thanks, Sarah. The goal here really, I think, more than anything else, is that there's been a lot of processes that have been ad hoc as we've been pulling together and sort of, as the project has grown, as we found ways to sort of, distribute decision making. And ideally, this is a way to sort of take some of those things, make them more official, get them written down. And I think, and to answer a bunch of questions that I think people who are not sort of, armpit deep in the project have when they actually want to get involved, right? Things like, who do I talk to about this particular component? How do I get a PR into this, into Kubernetes, and who needs to approve it? How do I do larger efforts that cut across a whole bunch of things? What's the process for doing that? How do I, start to build relationships so that, if things work out, I can start to take leadership roles inside of the project, provide a little bit of an on-ramp there for that stuff. All this stuff has been working, so I don't think that there's anything necessarily broken with the project. But I think we need to make it easier to have other people join in and figure out how to actually start down this path and get stuff done.
It needs to be moved from tribal knowledge to a more referenceable process functionally.
So I shared the link in the chat. I'll avoid doing a screen share here unless you think that'd be helpful. I think screen sharing documents can be a little bit tricky. It basically breaks down into a couple of things. So the first thing in the document is an idea of components, breaking the project up into smaller sub-projects with some clear ownership and mapping from those components onto directories in the, I got some echo there, in the source code. Over time, hopefully we, as in we the community, can build automated tools so that people who have some sort of owner or maintainer across a component gets power there without power over the entire project. That stuff can come in time as we can figure out how this stuff works. Ideally, we can rationalize this stuff with the SIGs. So that a component and a SIG line up well. I mean, there may be some SIGs that cut across things, but I think that there's definitely some confusion there. This type of model around ownership over directories is the way that Google operates internally, and it's a way to scale a large code base. So at least there's some prior art in terms of the experiences with those at Google, but I don't know, and I'm sure it's been done, but I don't have any examples off the top of my head of open source projects that have done similar things. I don't know, Sarah, do you have any?
Joe?
Yeah.
Have you seen the owner's proposal and everything that we worked out with Red Hat, with Eric Paris and those folks in the and the work actually that he started on that stuff? Yeah.
So there's a pointer in there to that PR. I think some of this is the tooling around ownership, but also the culture around the fact that moving from a everybody kibitzes and vetoes on everything to sort of like people start to specialize and there's some clear lines of sight. And so I think we can get those clear lines of sight even if we don't have the technical mechanisms in place yet. I mean, it's really, it could be a page and some documentation, and every time people's like, well, who do I talk to about X? We just point them to that page, right? So that's just the place to start, is just getting this stuff written down and pulled together into one place. And that's the idea. Brian?
Yeah, one thing we could use help with is, even to people who are deep in the project, it's not always obvious who is available, for example, to assign code reviews to. So, if someone just went and mined Git history of who's done a lot of work on different directories, that would be a huge help to this process. Because I think we're going to have multiple tiers of levels of responsibility. We're going to have people who can improve things. So that's more like the Google concept of owners. But we also just need like first-line reviewers. people who are familiar with the code, who will be responsive to a code review, that we can assign that stuff automatically when a PR comes in.
Which lines up directly to one of the things that I'm trying to work on, which is giving a progression ladder from my first pull request to someday being a committer, and reviewer is in there somewhere. But right now it's fairly messy and not clear how you might make that progress and who might make those decisions. So working on, again, codifying a lot of these things that have been very organic to date.
Maybe working with GitHub on figuring out the right way to do this. They haven't been very responsive to requests in these areas in the past, so we're working around them with all kinds of bots.
Right.
Which maybe is necessary, but like figuring out the right structure with how we can have a team of people that can be notified on issues and pull requests, and use those same teams of people for assigning PRs and things like that.
Right, and even if we don't have the tooling in place, just getting a file in each directory, that says here's the people to go to for reviewing. Here's sort of the overall owners for this component, and we can borrow the syntax from sort of the proposal there and get a jump on that.
Yeah, I think the Eric's big concerns with going forward are, not every single directory would have an owner's file, or if it did, it would be hard to keep up to date. So there was concern about the usability, I guess, of figuring out who, for a given directory, has authority to approve or who could review it. So we need some sort of dashboard or something that people could query to figure out, like the roll-up of transitive.
Right, the inherited models.
Yeah, the inheritance, exactly.
But Eric, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I liked your approach on component owners for sort of what I would call smaller changes. I think it makes a lot of sense. If we're ready to talk about efforts, I had some questions there. Is now a good time for that, or?
All right, let's close on components, and then we can talk about the effort stuff. I think the last point on components is the fact that what Brian was bringing up. Thanks, Oliver. The fact that that Brian brought up the idea that there is no clear owner that's actually part of the problem, right? I mean, is that there's a ton of code in the code base. There's a ton of stuff that it's like, well, what component does this own to? Does this belong to? And so it ends up being sort of like a no man's land that falls through the cracks.
I don't think we should.
I don't know what the solution is there, but at least we can shine a light on that and actually sort of see the places in the code base where there is no clear owner. And yeah.
Let's not fixate on there being not perfect owners coverage. Let's try to get owners on like directories that cover 75% of small changes, and then have, a backstop owner, and then iterate from there. I mean,
we can exception process later.
I think it's important too that like when we talk about components, the goal of the component owner usually is to have a vision and understanding of what's going on so that they can communicate that effectively to others. And that's usually the most valuable part of the component owner process, is someone who can kind of, well, did you take this into account? Did you take this into account? To be the hub on a number of discussions. And if they accomplish that, I think that's the vast majority of their benefit.
There's another component role in that, which is the growth of the future leadership as well, by sharing those visions, by sharing those understandings, and by working with the people who are interested in those spaces.
Yeah, I know.
What I would say is that we have to have that vision, and then people who are the best that's not necessarily the same set of people who are the best just go code reviewers, making sure it's quality code. I could definitely see having splitting up responsibilities between code quality review, it might encompass test quality review with like conceptual review, or like how does it fit in the ecosystem review. So I don't know if I want to formalize those or not, but think about those.
Yeah, internally, as Joe knows, we have a readability process. I've been thinking something like that would be useful for our code base to train new code reviewers.
From Seattle, one observation. We have a interesting, component structure of our packages and our files, but that doesn't cleanly map to at least what people conceptually necessarily think of as components, especially given all the broad sharing. And I think we we do an okay job-ish at code review, and the issue is more of, if I want to do something like, insert new feature, it's not just one package or one path directory structure. It's not even one component, right? There are no changes that are like, oh, it's a kubelet change, I just need Dawn to sign off on it. Yeah, there are a few, but there are more things that are like cross-cutting across the control plane, across the kubelet, across networking stack. And so figuring out
that leads into the next discussion.
This is efforts, yes. This is the big efforts concept. Yeah.
Just one thought. Anyone who doesn't know what Conway's Law is should Google it after this meeting and consider it when they're in this discussion.
It is an important piece of this discussion because what we set up as process and what we have set up as code will influence one another.
Yes. So the next step here is this idea of how do we actually propose, track, prioritize efforts. And I use the word efforts based on the experience around trying to get some more focus on coordinated testing, right? Coordinated testing is not necessarily a feature, but it's one of the goals, one of the things that we want to get done for 1.3. And so effort is the term to actually essentially work that we want to get done that has some clear outcomes from it on a particular time frame that cuts across swaths of the project. And this becomes complicated because it may impact a set of things where there's no one person that actually has perfect knowledge across those things, right? So as we specialize, we're going to get to the point where, like Brian tries his hardest to read every single PR, but if we continue to scale the project, even Brian won't be able to keep up. And so we need to find a way to actually coordinate in the face of the fact that there'd be no single person that actually knows everything across the project. And so the idea there is to get a little bit of a progression around proposing stuff, getting review, identifying the places it's going to impact, and finding the list of people who are going to actually have to be involved to actually get this thing over the finish line. I think we've seen in the past with some of these efforts that, you can do something, you can get a PR, you thought you got buy-in from all the people that matter, you finally you're like, okay, I'm ready to go. And then all of a sudden at the 11th hour, somebody comes in and says, well, we should have so-and-so take a review of this or something like that. And then all of a sudden it sort of resets you back to much further earlier in the process. And so that can be very frustrating, very demotivating, and it's the type of thing that's going to impact people from outside the project who aren't as embedded in the project versus people that are more embedded in the project. And so I think perhaps people who sort of, spend, their waking time with Kubernetes from the get-go aren't seeing this as much as people who are more casual to the project. I tried to, in the stuff that I wrote in the document, I tried not to be too heavy-handed in the process. I mean, as you go through this stuff, you can get to the point where you have, design doc templates, and you have a laundry list of people who have to, approve things, and you have gates, and it's a 37-step process. I don't think we're there. I'm hoping we're not there. And I think that the process itself can be demotivating. And so I think, we're all adults, I think everybody wants to work together. So I'm assuming that, common sense plays into this also, and we don't have to actually spell everything out in excruciating detail. So just getting the broad strokes written down, I think will be actually a huge improvement. So read the proposal with that in mind, that it doesn't have to be exhaustive, and we can adapt and add and hope maybe even remove stuff as we find that it doesn't add value. If you guys want to take some time and maybe take a quick glance over that section, or if folks have some comments, I'd love to discuss that.
Yeah, thanks I had a question about.
All right, who wants to go first? Eric, were you talking?
Sure. When you talked about efforts, you kind of implied that, I couldn't tell if you're implying that an effort is approved when the union of or the intersection of all affected component owners approves, or would there be other types of owners or approvers whose view is broader than a single component?
I think, again, this is I think this is a good question. I mean, it's one of those things where some changes, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? It's like you can touch a whole bunch of components, but really this change could be a philosophical shift or in direction for the project. I'm assuming that, as we socialize these ideas, so like one of the things that I'd want to do is, as a design doc gets written, as these things get socialized, they get sent out on the mailing list, which will hopefully be lower traffic than the list of PRs. And so that's a great place for people who have strong opinions, widely across the project to be able to weigh in. I don't think we necessarily need to have, a set of dictators who vote on things. I think we can still operate by consensus here.
I've seen projects fail when everyone approved a new feature in their area, but the total set of new features was eventually drag the project down. I'd like some articulation of not necessarily heavyweight process, but some way we see someone whose ownership is over the scope of concern for Kubernetes. Another way I've heard this described is every engineering project has a constrained resource, and our constrained resource, we have to decide what that is. It might be how many concepts our users can fit in their heads when they think about what Kubernetes is. Whatever we think that constrained resource is for the total project, we need an owner for that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I had in my brain, and I'd sort of talk with Sarah about a little bit, is does Kubernetes need some sort of, I don't even know what the right name is, but some sort of like governing group where it's like these are the leads across the entire project that can review some of this stuff, that can actually help direct stuff. I think it's been very ad hoc right now. It might be useful to actually put some names on a list and say these are the people who are sort of setting the philosophical direction for the project, and I can take on sort of squishy issues like that. Again, I think making this be too ironclad, too much of like we must have a quorum, and I don't think we need to go there yet, or maybe ever at all. But I think that's some of what you're asking about there, Eric, and I don't know if that resonates with others.
Let me add. So Joe, thanks. First of all, thanks a ton for taking this on. This is, I think, a really important step for the community at large. So thanks again for that. I think I'll echo that concern and say it resonates, and I'll put it this way, which is I've been involved in large similar open source projects to this in the past that suffered from feature bloat. And I think one of the important questions is not what's the process for putting a bunch of new features in and how do we do that, how do we prioritize that, but how do we maintain simplicity, how do we make sure we're saying no to the right things, how do we keep a system that's at high quality and stable and performs well as opposed to one that's kind of clunky and has lots and lots of features on it. So I certainly think the thinking around efforts is one of the ways to do that, but how we say no to things as a project, I think is it's a tough problem, but it's going to be an important one.
Well, I think that part of this is that with some of the features we're adding, so I'm in the very last throes of adding third-party objects, right? And once that's in, that's a much easier path for saying maybe to people, right? To say like, you know what, we're not going to do that, but prove it out. You can do it entirely outside of our code base. Show us how it works, and if enough people use it, we'll consider moving it in. And I think we'd be pretty aggressive about doing that kind of stuff, right? I really think that we shouldn't be adding any new concepts. Just as we went through this process of saying, like, we're going to only add APIs to beta first, I think we should go through a similar process and say, you know, we're not going to add new concepts to the API surface first. We're going to add them as extensions first, and then, like, totally external extensions, and bring them in if necessary.
So on the saying no, I think it's probably less binary than that, because I think there's no philosophical reasons of like what is the scope of the project, but I think that there's also a role for prioritization as we have a lot of efforts and as they cut across different groups. I think having clear prioritization in the project can help direct some of the other scarce resources we have, like code review time, like meeting and review time, right? And so I think as we do things like plan for a milestone, being able to actually say no for hard scope reasons, or not yet, or let's push that to next release because we just don't have bandwidth or capacity. I think we have to have a process for being able to actually go through and do that. In terms of the no for philosophical reasons, one of the ideas that I've been pushing there at KubeCon in Europe was, and it's based on Brad Fitz's thing on Go 1.6, where Go is now boring, and that's actually a feature, right? I actually think we want to get to the point where Kubernetes, at least the core of Kubernetes, is boring, right? Because if it's boring, that means it's solid. That means that people can build on top of it. That means that it's predictable. And that's actually a good thing in a project.
It's cleanly bounded. We know exactly what it isn't, and those are places for people to evolve and build ecosystem.
And then having opportunities for folks to build stuff, whether it's part of the Kubernetes project but not part of Kubernetes core, or whether it's other projects that are part of, like now that we have the CNCF to lean on for actually doing some of this stuff, I think that makes a ton of sense. So I think finding a way to actually sort of make Kubernetes boring, it should be, I think, one of the goals of the community.
I think we're already there too, in the sense that the big, well, I mean, not there, but like the big push for 1.3 is Kubernetes, right? And in some level, that's a completely separate, maybe it'll be in the code base, but it is not the same kind of thing as adding in config maps or anything else like that.
Yeah, and stuff like ingress being out of core also, I think is a great example of moving in that right direction.
Although the counter example is we will continue to add things to pods until pods don't work anymore. So I'm sure there will always be areas of disagreement or areas of evolution in the project. And maybe that's another thing that we need to map out what those areas of evolution are, like taking the things that Joe and Brendan are describing and getting those written down somewhere. We can say, we want to evolve this to a known point, and then that's when it's done.
Maybe the answer is the owner for the package API directory is the person who does all the things I just said, say no to things. So, I mean, if maybe your component model does work as long as package API is a component.
Well, I think APIs are a little bit special because I do think we want to avoid having a single person who has dictatorial powers here. I mean, at least one of the things that for me has characterized Kubernetes is that it's been led by a group of relatively senior engineers who work well and trust each other. And I don't want to lose that. And I think that's an important quality of the community that we've built so far. So quick straw poll here. I mean, do you folks think it makes sense to have some sort of, Kubernetes governing, group where we identify the set of people who can get together and drive consensus around some of these sticky issues? Or do you think we should keep it very wide open as we and sort of more ad hoc and sort of behind the scenes as things are now?
We've talked about, oh, sorry, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say there's two pieces to that, because we can keep it very ad hoc and just have an escalation board. That would be the other, they are
Right.
big vision and escalation when things don't work as an ad hoc. Go on.
Well, I think we talked about it a long time ago, and we've never instituted it, but I think we should do it, is effectively having a design review hour that is every 2 weeks or something like that, and it's not just because we think that there's some things we need to go through and get consensus as a group, but it's also because it enables people to not focus on those things the rest of the time, right? So it kind of time bounds the amount of time you spend thinking about the big things, and it enables you to focus on other things and not have to be sort of constantly worried that something's going to slip by because you're not paying attention. I think that's the right answer. Yeah, I think in some sense the SIGs are one of those answers, but then there's a SIG can decide that an API object is necessary.
And that cuts across more
and
things.
it cuts across lots of things, and you need to get sort of broader agreement. And so I think that, I think having a process like that is good.
So I think, Brendan, when the community was a little smaller and the project was first starting, that's what this meeting did in a lot of cases. I I remember back when we had 4 or 5 API objects, when you added a 6th, we kind of talked about it here. And I think this meeting has shifted away from that. And so I'm generally in favor of feeling like there was something that that brought together the SIGs that was more development focused and maybe less how the community is using the product focused. So I would be supportive of that.
Yeah, and one of the proposals actually was just to alternate, right? Not add another meeting to everybody's calendar, but just like every other one is a more technical. One is a community one is a technical one is something like that.
Okay, to do that, we need people putting things forward because the agenda right now is broadly open. So if somebody wants to talk about something really deeply technical, put it on the agenda, or we can say it's every other week. That's fine. We just need to put those things forward into this meeting and make sure that the right people are attending. So I don't track. I am no Brian Grant. I do not track all the pull requests, and I don't see the big visions that where a lot of these overlaps happen. So if people want to put them forward, I'm happy to put them on the agenda, facilitate them. It's an open agenda. Add your items. Go, Joe.
So I would suggest that, one of the things that have characterized Kubernetes are these absolute monster pull request threads. And I actually think it's great because it captures so much discussion, so much back and forth. It's great when people ask a question of like, well, why aren't you guys doing gRPC? That you can point them to one of these things saying, here's the gory details, knock yourself out. I think what we don't do well is to actually bookend this with some sort of conclusion and communication of sort of what was the result of all of that stuff. And so I think, for those who can keep up with those monster threads, more power to you. I mean, I just don't think there's enough hours in the day. And so I would propose that as those things wind down and close off, if it's a document-based thing, actually go through and, fold all that stuff into the document, and then maybe say, okay, let's go ahead and present this so that we can communicate this stuff. Hopefully we can do it in a way that, doesn't reopen everything, right? But I think there is a need to actually communicate this stuff more widely.
Right. So Joe, this is Rob Hirschfeld. I think you're right. I find that the pull request threads are very ephemeral. And so I think that what you're describing is sort of a tome of wisdom for Kubernetes, but more than wisdom, it's guidance, right? But it has to evolve over time so you can say, hey, we just had this hard, long discussion and we came down to this position, right? I mean, we just had one, right? We're talking about APIs, persistence versus external components, and that's really a discussion that should become part of the tome, and with the goal of it being 20 pages tops, right? And say, all right, every time something gets too, if it's this too long, we kick it out. But I do think that if we say we're going to have this evolving tome and we document, out of tribal knowledge into this is principles. If you have a body in charge of defending that and that becomes the rule, then I think it's a good step.
And that starts to sound like that vision group that is the arbiter if things are a challenge and the keeper of the wisdom at some level.
The thing that I'm watching, my other favorite open source project try and evolve into this is there's a project management element to that group, because they effectively are doing things very customer focused and vision focused and things like that. That group has to have the power. If you don't have an individual, then if it's not in the tome, it's not, so somewhere in the structure, you have to have that body or that document have authority, have dictatorial authority, if you will.
I think so. I mean, at some point you have to make some hard decisions, and I think we should actually have that process written down about how hard decisions are made. Ideally, I think for a well-functioning community, utilizing that process ends up being rare, right? If everybody is mind melded and that there's actually a common understanding, hopefully, the goal should be that you don't have to actually use that power, or, hardly ever, right? That's at least the goal.
No,
right?
Joe, I think you just wrote page 1 in my vision of the tome starts with exactly what you said.
Yeah.
And says, and this is how we resolve the debate. Page 1.
Like it should be a break glass type of thing of like, we failed as a well-functioning community if we have to actually resort to that type of process, in my mind.
But I think you start with that on page 1, and then next, it's like the Constitution, and the next 19 pages are, these are the places where we couldn't, we had to write it down because otherwise it was contentious.
Okay, so we're running down to the last 10 minutes. I want to make sure that we have things that are A, actionable, and B, also give an opportunity if the 2 SIGs who threw their names on the list wanted to do any substantive update beyond just notes. So I'm hearing more evolution and conversation in the document that Joe put forward. I'm hearing that we need to potentially find sort of the project elders and define that group and coalesce them, bring them to this meeting and say, is this the right group as the elders for the
I like elders is not a bad word there.
Yeah.
Like,
so we need to define a set of elders and then that then becomes the very top end of the ladder that I want to build above even just project committers. You have the elders as like kind of the high end of that, and then there's also the need for defining a group that wants to start codifying some of this tribal knowledge. Did I hit all of the things that we need to start on? All right.
I had one very brief comment that I've been waiting to find the right moment for.
Jump in.
I think it would be very useful. There's been lots of useful discussion here about what works well and what doesn't work well, and what the failure modes we want to avoid, not being able to make any progress because we have a decision by committee, etc. I think it'd be very useful to summarize what the problems are that we're trying to solve and what the things we have at the moment that we think work okay or well, and the things that we don't think work well. And I guess as importantly, the stuff that we want to avoid in the future. Many of these kinds of projects fail in fairly common ways. There are a couple of classic failure modes. The code base becomes chaos and we can't make any progress, or we can't come to decisions, therefore things stop making progress. I think putting down I guess 3 or 4 paragraph explanation of exactly what it is we see as the vision for, or see as the problems we're trying to solve, and then all of these things that we've discussed today about how to do that are very squarely focused on solving a well understood problem.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
I would love to know, is there another open source project that we look up to whose model we want to copy? And if there isn't, why are we different? I'm totally naive, but if someone who's more open source savvy than me could say a few words about that next time, I would find that very valuable.
So I would say that there are probably a handful of projects that we find components very admirable in, and that finding that list from this group would be amazing. Cool.
But a part of open source is reinventing all your own stuff, right? I mean, that's...
No.
No, that's a very good point, Eric. Thank you. So let's continue. Please add comments to the doc. I'll try and resolve stuff, and we can take that as a conversation. I think we can continue this next week. If anybody wants to talk to me one-on-one about this stuff, happy to do that. And we can figure out the next steps there. So I'll bow out now, and we have 5 minutes for the rest of the agenda.
That's fine. I will go quickly because Aaron was gracious and said SIG testing can wait till next week, and Rob jumped off and just left us notes for cluster ops. So the SIG reports are handled well enough anyway. And then the community commitments, I was going to ask if anyone else wanted to bring forward things that they were going to that they were expecting to work on within 1.3, and there is one API SIGs priority doc that I'm going to put notes into I'm going to put a link to that document into the notes. So I don't know that we need a whole lot more time there, but if anybody has things they want to add or wants to talk about features or work that they're doing in the 1.3 timeline now would be a great moment. Okay. Hey, we had a really productive discussion. We've got some good, clean action items out of it, and was super excited to hear all of the viewpoints. And that I think fundamentally we all agree. We just have to figure out how to get to the best possible outcome for Kubernetes. This is, there's a lot of stuff that's been going amazingly right. Let's keep that up and then make it more clear for people to join us, because that's a big, hard on-ramp for people who are new to the project, is all of this historical and tribal knowledge that is amazing and has worked so very well. But if you're showing up day one, how do I actually make a meaningful contribution? The answer should not be go read all of GitHub. That would be a really hard on-ramp. So that's another thing that I'm working on, is trying to figure out what that early on-ramp is for new contributors, so that we can continue to scale this project. Anybody else, or are we going to actually end this not at the very last possible moment today? We're good?
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Have a great week, and we will, I'm sure, have more conversations about this in parts and going next week. So see you all next week.
Bye.
Thanks. See you all.
Bye.